March 1944. Inside an underground room of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Communications Intelligence Unit, the night felt unnaturally long. Vacuum tubes glowed faintly across rows of radio equipment, casting thin bands of light onto the tired faces of cryptanalysts who had not slept for hours. These men had once broken American diplomatic traffic with confidence. They had defeated the Purple Code. They believed no message sent by the United States could remain hidden from them. But tonight, everything was silent. Not the room, but the minds inside it. They were staring at a stream of intercepted sounds, sharp, clipped, rhythmic, arriving just minutes before each marine assault in the Marshall Islands. The transmissions were ordered, measured, undeniably military. Yet the language behind them slipped through every technique the Japanese had mastered. It was not English, not Chinese, not any Pacific dialect, not even distorted radio noise. It was something they had never encountered. In his shift log, a young intelligence officer wrote a single line. "This is not a code. This is a voice from a world we do not know." None of them realized they were listening to a language born in the deserts of the American Southwest, spoken by a small nation whose existence many in Japan had never even heard of. A language preserved for centuries, carried now by marine radio operators who would become the central nervous system of the Pacific battlefield. And in the months ahead, that language would blind Japan's intelligence network completely, leaving their armies to fight in total darkness. March 1944. Inside a reinforced concrete building more than 20 miles from Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary signals intelligence facility worked without pause. The air vibrated with the hum of radio receivers, the faint crackle of frequency shifts, and the constant murmur of specialists comparing notes over stacks of intercepts. For years, this place had been the heart of Japan's cryptographic confidence, an institution that had cracked foreign codes across Asia and the Pacific. The main room was dim, lit only by desk lamps and the glow of equipment valves. Rows of technicians sat with headsets pressed tightly to their ears, adjusting dials with practiced precision. They were trained to detect the slight tremor in a Morse signal, the rhythm of American ship-to-ship chatter, or the cadence of Allied Army transmissions. Their entire mindset was built on the belief that every message had a pattern, and every pattern could be broken. Tonight, however, they faced something utterly different, something beyond the reach of their charts, methods, and logic. The intercepted sounds were not static. They were not mechanical cipher pulses. They were not distorted English phrases. Instead, they arrived in tight, structured clusters that matched the pace of American marine operations. The timing made perfect sense. The meaning made none. One analyst wrote in his shift notes, "Recognizable as speech, but not any human speech we know." None of the men in that room realized that what they were hearing came from an indigenous nation thousands of miles away, from a desert people they had never considered, a people whose language had evolved for centuries outside the reach of global scholarship, whose sounds contradicted everything Japanese linguistics was built upon. Within a few months, those unfamiliar syllables would become the single factor that dismantled Japan's battlefield intelligence, turning their most skilled cryptanalysts into helpless listeners. To understand the shock, it is necessary to look at Japan's cryptologic success before 1944. Japan believed it stood at the forefront of global code breaking. Its naval intelligence divisions had cracked American diplomatic channels, British naval communications, Dutch colonial codes, multiple U.S. Army systems, and most famously, the Purple Code of the U.S. State Department. Before the war, Japanese intelligence officers read American diplomatic messages, sometimes before American ambassadors read them. The pride built from such victories created a deep, almost unshakable certainty. There is no Allied code Japan cannot break. That certainty shattered the moment they encountered the new marine transmissions. There were no repeated elements to analyze, no predictable structure, no vowel-consonant patterns, no viable way to map symbols to meanings, no statistical foothold for frequency analysis. To Japan's cryptanalysts, experts who live for patterns, this was not a code, it was a wall. One senior officer summarized the situation. "It is language, but it is not of any language we have recorded." The Japanese Empire had prepared for American machinery, encryption devices, and Western linguistic systems, but they had never prepared for the diversity of the United States, and certainly not for a language rooted in oral tradition and cultural memory. Far from the Pacific battlefields, the American Southwest stretched wide under a scorching sun. Red rock mesas, dry valleys, scattered juniper, and ancient canyons. This was the homeland of the Navajo Nation, whose people had preserved a linguistic world unlike any other on Earth. The Navajo language was not built for foreign learners. It was built for storytelling, ceremony, and precise description of life. It was fluid, complex, and deeply tied to worldview. Navajo is verb-centered with action-based constructions that can shift meaning across hundreds of forms depending on tone, intensity, number, or context. Its phonology contained ejective consonants, glottalized sonorants, voiceless lateral fricatives, nasal vowels, and four tones, high, low, rising, falling. A single mispronounced syllable could collapse a sentence. To a native Japanese speaker, trained in a five-vowel system, accurately hearing Navajo was nearly impossible. Even American officers who served next to Navajo Marines often admitted it sounded nothing like any language they had heard. This was the fortress Japan's intelligence was unknowingly fighting. The spark that ignited the Code Talker program came not from a general or a cryptographer, but from Philip Johnston, a man almost unknown outside military circles. Born in 1892 to a missionary family living on Navajo land, Johnston grew up speaking Navajo fluently. He understood not only the words, but the deeper logic of how Navajo speakers conceptualize the world. After reading about the use of native speakers in earlier American operations, Johnston approached the Marine Corps with an idea so unconventional that officers first dismissed it. His argument was simple. No enemy linguist on Earth understands this language. On February 28, 1942, Johnston conducted a demonstration at Camp Elliott. 4 Navajo volunteers transmitted a detailed message. 2 Marine officers timed it. Navajo transmission, 20 seconds. M209 encryption machine, 30 minutes. The difference was not a gap. It was a chasm. General Vogel ended the demonstration with a short order. Begin at once. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo recruits signed into the Marine Corps. Some came from remote sheep camps. Some from boarding schools where speaking Navajo had been punished. Some had never seen the ocean. Inside a locked room at Camp Elliott, they set out to build the first version of the code. They created a military lexicon rooted in Navajo imagery, a multivariant alphabet system, a structure that relied entirely on memory. A battleship became Lotso, whale. A submarine became Besh-Lo, iron fish. A fighter aircraft became Da-Hiti-Hai, hummingbird. For letters, they used rotating sets of Navajo words to destroy frequency analysis. No written materials, no notebooks, no charts. In 8 weeks, they produced 211 operational terms and memorized every one of them. It was one of the most extraordinary acts of improvisational cryptography in history. August 1942. The Marines landed at Guadalcanal, and with them, the first Navajo Code Talkers entered combat. Japan had anticipated the invasion, intercepting Allied signals in the Solomon Islands. But suddenly, everything changed. The transmissions that once yielded battlefield intelligence turned unreadable. At the Japanese 8th Fleet's headquarters in Rabaul, Stanford-educated officer Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada analyzed the audio. His conclusion, these are structured as language, yet they match nothing. When Chester Nez transmitted artillery coordinates that wiped out a Japanese machine gun nest on November 8th, the message was intercepted, but completely meaningless to the listeners. The Japanese intelligence machine, renowned for skill and precision, had just encountered the one element it could not defeat. Between 1942 and 1943, Japan attempted everything: phonetic breakdown, linguistic comparison, tonal analysis, slowed recordings, consultation with scholars, interrogation of Joe Kiyumiya, a captured Navajo soldier. But Kiyumiya had never been trained in the code. He heard only familiar words arranged in patterns without meaning. A classified Japanese report concluded, the prisoner speaks the mystery language but cannot interpret the messages. The truth was simple. Even fluent Navajo speakers could not understand Code Talker messages without training. By late 1943, the Japanese High Command quietly stopped trying. Success at Guadalcanal changed how the Marine Corps viewed Navajo. The program expanded rapidly from 29 to more than 400 Navajo Marines. Dedicated schools created at Camp Pendleton. Continuous updates to the code. Commanders realized something crucial. Navajo was not just secure ... It was faster than any machine the United States possessed. Ahead of the climactic battles of 1944 to 1945, the Marines implemented 3 strategic decisions: deploy code talkers at every echelon, rotate code variants to avoid long-term analysis, maintain absolute secrecy around the program. The United States had unintentionally created a weapon Japan had no defense against. Not a bomb, not a vehicle, not a machine, but a language. A language carried by young men who had grown up far from any battlefield, yet would soon become indispensable to every major Marine operation. The world was about to witness Navajo's greatest test. The next battles, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and ultimately Iwo Jima, would prove that the Unbreakable Code was not a theory. It was a force that shaped the outcome of the Pacific War. By late 1943, the Pacific had transformed from scattered island clashes into a coordinated American advance that moved with relentless force. The Central Pacific Drive demanded precision, timing, fire support, and rapid maneuvering across deadly beaches. Without flawless communication, every landing risked collapse. For the Marines, this meant one thing. Navajo Code Talkers were no longer an experiment. They were the backbone of assault operations. In every Higgins boat bouncing violently across the surf, behind every tank struggling through coral reefs, in command posts carved from sand and volcanic ash, there was always at least one Navajo Marine wearing a headset, radio slung across his back, ready to speak sounds the Japanese could not comprehend. The Pacific War had entered a phase where seconds meant survival, and the only system capable of delivering secure orders in seconds was the Navajo Code. Tarawa was the first full demonstration of how indispensable code talkers had become. The Japanese had fortified the tiny atoll into a fortress. Strong points were built of coconut logs and steel rails. Machine guns overlapped fields of fire so precisely that even the tide worked against the Marines. Within minutes of the landing, chaos consumed the beaches. Amtraks burned in the surf. Marines waded through water stained black with oil and blood. Radio operators were primary targets. Communications collapsed under constant fire. But the Navajo Code Talkers endured. Inside shallow shell holes and makeshift pits, 6 code talkers maintained radio nets through every hour of the battle. Under artillery bursts that blew sand and coral into their faces, they are relayed fire missions, directed naval gunfire, coordinated landing waves, called for ammunition and reinforcements. Lloyd Oliver transmitted continuously for nearly 48 hours, his voice raw, eyes sunken, uniform soaked with seawater and smoke. When the beaches were finally secured, commanders noted an astonishing detail. Despite the chaos, every Navajo transmission had gone through cleanly. The Japanese had intercepted them, but not one was understood. Tarawa had been conquered by blood and steel, but held together by voices speaking a language older than any empire in the Pacific. Saipan was different. It was not a fortress. It was the doorway to Japan itself. If Saipan fell, American bombers would be within direct range of Tokyo. Japan threw everything into the battle, the elite 43rd Infantry Regiment, tanks hidden in cane fields, sniper teams woven into caves, coordinated night attacks. Yet the code talkers cut the battlefield into clear lines of communication. 24 Navajo Marines worked around the clock, linking division headquarters to regiments, linking regiments to companies, linking forward observers to artillery batteries, relaying fast-moving reports from scouts. When Japanese officers tried to intercept and predict American moves, they found only meaningless bursts of sound. A surviving intelligence officer later wrote, "We felt abandoned by information. The Americans fought as if guided by a hand we could not see." One code talker, wounded by shrapnel through the shoulder, continued transmitting until he collapsed. The fire mission he relayed shattered a Japanese counterattack that would have cut off 2 Marine companies. Saipan revealed a truth the Japanese high command could no longer deny. The Americans possessed a communication system Japan could not touch. The battle for Peleliu became one of the darkest tests for the Navajo Marines. The island was scorched by heat. Caves riddled the coral ridges. Japanese troops defended from underground tunnels that could not be destroyed easily. Within this labyrinth of fire, code talkers pushed their radios uphill, dragging them through shattered coral, slipping on loose rock, climbing under sniper fire. Jimmy King's story became emblematic of the cost. His partner was killed beside him. He was forced to transmit alone. A Japanese machine gun swept across his position. He held the mouthpiece steady while enemy shells struck meters away. For 6 hours, he sent more than 40 messages coordinating artillery fire from 3 battalions. Not one was incorrect. Not one was delayed. Peleliu was a battle where the terrain chewed through entire companies. Yet the code talkers treated every message as if the survival of the entire island rested on a single word. In many cases, it did. Everything the Marines had faced before was a prelude. Iwo Jima was the real test. The Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had studied American warfare extensively. He knew U.S. tactics, timing, and radio procedures. He built an underground fortress with 11 miles of tunnels, hidden artillery positions, camouflaged bunkers, interlocking fields of fire. He told his officers, break their communications, make them blind. But unbeknownst to him, the Americans had something his intelligence service had failed to identify. A code immune to interception, immune to decryption, and immune to mimicry. On the eve of the invasion, 6 Navajo Code Talkers prepared their radio sets. They knew they were stepping into a killing ground. They also knew that if they failed, the entire landing could collapse. Their role was simple, yet impossible. Run the command network for the largest marine assault in history. While under the heaviest fire ever recorded by the Corps, February 19, 1945, the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima swallowed boots and slowed every step. Infantrymen staggered forward under accurate Japanese fire. Tanks bogged down. Landing craft were torn apart by hidden guns. But the radios lived. The network stayed intact. And the Navajo Code Talkers never stopped speaking. For the first 48 hours, 6 Navajo Marines handled every major division-level transmission. More than 800 messages were sent with perfect accuracy. Not a single transmission was misinterpreted or delayed. Artillery, naval gunfire, close air support, and troop movements all synchronized through Navajo. Major Howard Connor later said, if it were not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Kuribayashi's entire defensive plan depended on intercepting American communications. The Navajo Code made that plan impossible. The Japanese fought without intelligence, like a man swinging blindly in the dark. This was the turning point. The moment the battlefield shifted irreversibly, a language unrecorded in any Japanese archive had decided the fate of an island and the strategy of an empire. By the time Mount Suribachi fell and the flag was raised, the Code Talkers had no moment to celebrate. Even as the iconic photograph was taken, they were below the slopes transmitting casualty reports. Coordinates of machine gun nests, requests for ammunition, emergency orders for medevac, shifts in Japanese resistance. They were not photographed. They were not named. They stayed in the shadows as invisible as the code they carried. Yet their voices ran through every victory. The turning point of the Pacific War was not simply the Marines storming beaches. It was the existence of a communication system that Japan could not understand, could not imitate, and could not silence. After Iwo Jima, Japan's military intelligence effectively collapsed. Their officers sent urgent messages up the chain. American codes remain unbreakable. We cannot read battlefield transmissions. We fight without eyes. The Empire had prepared for American machines. They had prepared for mathematical encryption, but they had not prepared for the power of a culture they did not know existed. Navajo became the beating heart of the U.S. advance toward Okinawa, and the final months of the Pacific War began under a shroud of Japanese uncertainty unlike anything they had imagined. The landings had proven the power of the Navajo Code. But the hardest part of their story did not lie in the first 48 hours of Iwo Jima or the frantic radio volleys of Saipan. It lay in the long, suffocating hours inside the battlefield's underbelly. The moments where life hung by a breath and where silence carried more weight than gunfire. To most Americans, Marines were men of steel storming beaches and charging bunkers. But for the Navajo Code Talkers, war was something different. It was the collision between a sacred language and a world torn apart by smoke and death. Their battlefield was not only foxholes and ridges, it was the small enclosed space inside a radio headset where every word controlled lives. The radio became their front line. Their radios filled with the rattle of gunfire behind them, cries for medics, frantic requests for ammunition, commanders shouting to hold the line, the static-filled breathing of men trapped under fire. Each Navajo syllable they spoke cut through the chaos with surgical precision, but they could never falter. A single tonal error could alter coordinates. A single misread order could destroy an American position. They understood the truth. On the battlefield, language itself could kill. Across the volcanic islands of the Pacific, code talkers worked inside hastily dug pits, holes reinforced with driftwood, sandbags, and pieces of broken plank. The space was barely large enough to crouch in. Sunlight never reached these holes. Only the faint, ghostly glow of a covered flashlight illuminated the maps spread across the dirt. They sat shoulder to shoulder, knees pressed against radios that vibrated with the pulse of war. Their ears carried the entire battlefield, but their bodies were trapped underground. Pressure without a name. Most code talkers were barely 17 to 21 years old. Some had grown up herding sheep. Some had never left the reservation before the war. But in these cramped pits, they became the central nervous system of entire Marine regiments. They had no time to think, no space to fear, only a relentless sequence: receive message, convert to Navajo, transmit, receive reply, translate back, send it out again. With artillery firing overhead and sand raining from the bunker ceiling, they were expected to perform flawlessly. One of them later said, "We sat in the dark, but our words traveled across the whole battlefield." By 1943, Japan realized something terrifying. These strange voices in intercepted radio logs were not a mechanical code. They were human. Japanese commanders issued new orders: prioritize killing radio operators, capture them alive if possible, seize equipment at all costs. But they made two devastating assumptions. 1. Code talkers carried no written materials. 2. Even if captured, they could not be forced to reveal the code, because the code didn't exist on paper. A tragic twist of war. In several battles, Navajo Marines were almost killed by their own side. White Marines, unfamiliar with indigenous features, sometimes mistook them for Japanese infiltrators. This was so common that many code talkers were assigned bodyguards, not to protect them from the enemy, but from friendly fire. War had turned irony into survival. A Navajo Marine carrying the most valuable communication system in the Pacific had to be protected from the soldiers he was saving. Unlike other radio units operating far from danger, Navajo code talkers were thrown directly into the front. Their radios had to be close enough to hear orders and close enough to send fire missions that mattered. Peleliu, a narrow escape from oblivion. Jimmy King was sending a message when a burst of Japanese machine gun fire tore through his position. His partner fell bleeding beside him. Jimmy dragged him back, pressed cloth onto the wound, and kept sending transmissions. Japanese infantry surged forward. Artillery erupted around the pit. The ground shook as if the island itself were breaking apart. But if Jimmy stopped transmitting even for a few seconds, 3 Marine companies on the ridge would be swallowed whole. So he continued, for 6 hours alone, speaking calmly in Navajo, while death scraped the edges of his bunker. Guadalcanal was the code talkers' baptism by fire. Many had never heard gunfire before the invasion. The jungle swallowed them. Rain soaked them. Mosquitoes carried disease. Japanese units attacked at night with bayonets and grenades. They endured everything every Marine endured: rotten rations, mud-filled foxholes, sudden ambushes, malaria, the constant smell of death. But they had one more burden. They could not allow their radios to fall into enemy hands. Several admitted later that if cornered, They were prepared to destroy the radio and use a grenade on themselves to prevent capture. Not out of fear, but because the code was more valuable than a single life. During a night battle on Saipan, a code talker was hit by shrapnel that tore into his shoulder and chest. Blood soaked his uniform. He could barely breathe. But his unit was pinned down. They had no line of retreat. They needed artillery immediately. He held the transmitter close, whispered coordinates through clenched teeth, and sent the message before collapsing. The barrage he called in shattered the Japanese assault and saved more than 100 Marines. When the Japanese later captured the transmission and studied it for weeks, they learned nothing. To them, it was still noise. Japan had cracked codes across Asia and the Pacific. But Navajo was not a code in the way they understood codes. It was a worldview tied to culture, tone, and identity. The real reasons behind Japan's failure ran deep. 1. Their academic institutions had no access to Native American languages. They had never documented Navajo. 2. Even a fluent Navajo speaker could not understand code talker messages. The code was layered on top of the language. 3. The Marines constantly added new terms and updated vocabulary. There were no patterns. 4. The Japanese cryptographic mindset was built for mathematical systems, not cultural systems. They prepared for machines, not for human diversity. One Japanese officer wrote after the war, "We were not defeated by numbers or weapons. We were defeated by a language." At Iwo Jima and Peleliu, code talkers pushed themselves beyond human limits. Some worked until they fainted. Some transmitted while feverish. Some transmitted while shells exploded just meters away. Some slept sitting up, headphones still around their necks. Their schedules blurred into a cycled 2 hours of messages, a few minutes of rest, forced relocation under fire, then more messages. A code talker at Peleliu recorded a fever of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, but begged not to be evacuated. "Without me, the platoon has no Navajo voice." On Saipan, code talkers often transmitted with bodies lying beside them, American and Japanese alike. The battlefield shifted so quickly that dead soldiers were sometimes the only cover they had. At Iwo Jima, 2 code talkers relayed artillery missions while bullets cracked into the sand inches from their helmets. One used the body of a Marine as a shield while keeping the radio antenna upright. Their words were steady, their breathing was calm. Their world had narrowed to a radio, a map, and the sound of Navajo. Many code talkers whispered Navajo prayers before transmitting. Not for protection, but to remind themselves of home. Some carried small medicine bundles, feathers, carved stones, pieces of cedar bark. Not superstition, but a link to something pure in the middle of horror. A captain once said, "They spoke in Navajo as if they were speaking at a dinner table, not in a war zone." That calmness anchored entire units. At first, the Navajo Marines believed they were simply radio men. But as battles grew in scale and complexity, they realized the truth. The Marines could not fight without them. More than once, officers told them, "If you die, our communications die." At Iwo Jima, where 30,000 Marines depended on their voices, the message was clear. They were not soldiers on the battlefield. They were the battlefield's voice. When the American flag rose over Mount Suribachi, the world captured the moment. Photographers immortalized it. Newspapers celebrated it. History remembered it. But beneath that mountain, 6 Navajo Marines kept speaking into radios, coordinating fire, requesting supplies, reporting casualties. They did not see the flag go up. Their voices were still guiding the fight. Victory was loud, but the code talkers' contribution was quiet and essential. They remained unseen, but their language changed the entire Pacific War. Summer 1945. Across the Pacific, the war pressed toward its final and bloodiest chapter. Okinawa. The air was thick with smoke, damp winds, and the metallic smell of exploded artillery shells. Navy battleships pounded the island day and night. Japanese guns answered from hidden caves carved deep into the limestone ridges. In this storm, more than 35 Navajo code talkers stood scattered across Marine lines, each anchoring a web of communication that kept entire regiments alive. Okinawa was not merely a battlefield. It was a grinding machine, breaking bodies, crushing morale, and testing the limits of endurance. For 82 days, the Code Talkers worked without respite. Every assault, every defensive stand, every desperate night counterattack. The war was ending, but for the Navajo Marines, the ending was its own descent into chaos. Okinawa forced Marines into conditions worse than anything they had seen before. Rain-flooded trenches. Japanese heavy mortars pulverized hilltops. Civilians fled between lines, terrified and broken. American units fought cave by cave, room by room. For the Code Talkers, survival meant transmitting while shells shook dirt from bunker ceilings, keeping radios dry under torrential rain, working with no rest to coordinate artillery, hearing the voices of wounded Marines crying for help, decoding frantic orders as units fractured under pressure. Many of them did not sleep for more than minutes at a time. More than one Code Talker passed out beside his radio, headphones still on. Their bodies broke long before their voices did. One Navajo Marine later recalled, "The island felt alive. It wanted to swallow us, but we kept transmitting." By 1945, Japanese cryptanalysts had reached a grim conclusion. The Marine Code could not be broken. It was not a matter of time or technique. It was defeat at a fundamental level. Reports filed in the last months of the war became increasingly resigned. American codes remain unreadable. Tactical transmissions are impossible to decipher. We lack any method to understand this language. The Empire had prepared for American machines. They had prepared for Western logic. They had not prepared for a language from an indigenous nation they knew nothing about. The truth settled across their intelligence units like dust. They were fighting blind, and nothing could change that. August 14, 1945. A transmission came through American headquarters. Japan had accepted surrender terms. The message needed to be sent immediately across Marine lines. At a radio post hidden behind sandbags and broken timbers, Code Talker Teddy Draper received it. He paused only for a breath, then spoke into the microphone. "Nehema atdegini adenil." Japan has surrendered. In that moment, the Navajo Code that had carried thousands of urgent battlefield orders also carried the sentence that ended the Pacific War. The first major Navajo message of the war had been an attack order. The last was peace. When the Code Talkers returned home, they were not greeted with parades. There were no articles, no medals, no ceremonies. They were told to keep everything secret. For more than 20 years, they could not tell their families what they had done. And when they came home, they discovered something even harder. Many of them were still not legally allowed to vote. Some restaurants refused them service. Some hotels denied them entry. They had fought for a country that still did not fully accept them. The contradiction cut deeper than any wound they received in war. War followed them into sleep. The Code Talkers carried memories they could not share, the sound of wounded Marines calling for help, the terror in voices of men facing last stands, the knowledge that a message they sent could cost or save lives, the faces of comrades buried hurriedly under volcanic ash, the echo of Navajo phrases in their minds long after the radios went silent. Chester Nez once said, "I heard Navajo in my dreams, but it wasn't our language, it was the battlefield speaking." Traditional Navajo ceremonies became their path to healing. Many underwent the enemy way ritual, designed to restore balance to those touched by war. Without it, some said, they would never have survived peace. The world finally learned the truth in 1968 when the program was declassified. Then recognition came like slow-moving waves. 1969. A Marine Division reunion honored them. 1982. President Reagan declared Navajo Code Talkers Day. 2001. President George W. Bush awarded gold medals to the original 29. Only 5 of the originals were alive to receive them. Bush's words echoed across the rotunda. "You gave this country a service only you could give." For many Code Talkers, this was the first time their nation acknowledged what they had done. The Code Talkers' story revealed truths far beyond the battlefield. Truth 1. The defeat of racial purity ideology. Japan believed in racial homogeneity and superiority. They prepared for Western methods, never imagining America's diversity could hold strategic power. Navajo shattered that belief. Truth 2. The revival of a forbidden language. Schools once punished Navajo children for speaking their tongue. Yet this same language helped save tens of thousands of American lives. Today, Navajo is taught with pride because of the Code Talkers. Truth 3, the only military code never broken. Tens of thousands of messages were sent, under fire, under exhaustion, across dozens of islands. Not one was deciphered. The Navajo Code remains the only unbroken spoken code in modern warfare. In 2014, Chester Nez, the last of the original 29, passed away. By 2024, only 2 code talkers from the wartime program remain alive. They speak publicly when able. Their voices soft, their memories sharp. They repeat the old coded terms, iron fish, hummingbird, metal egg. They honor the friends who never came home. One of them said, "We were just boy, but the war needed our language." Their story leaves the world with enduring lessons. 1. Technology does not win wars. People do. Machines can be broken. Codes can be cracked. But human culture, used wisely, can become an unbreakable shield. 2. Diversity is strategic power. America's strength in the Pacific was not only its industry, but its people. Many cultures, many languages, many stories joining for one purpose. 3. Some weapons create peace. The Navajo language was once used for ceremony and healing. During the war, it became a weapon. After the war, it returned to healing. Its resilience is what makes it powerful. 4. The unbreakable code was not mathematics. It was identity. As Japan's cryptanalysts sat in dark rooms trying to understand the incomprehensible, Navajo voices flowed across radios on distant islands. Steady, calm, unbreakable. The Code Talkers were not generals or strategists. They were shepherds, students, young men from red deserts and quiet canyons. But they shaped the course of the Pacific War with nothing more than memory, discipline, and the language of their ancestors. They saw the worst of war. They carried burdens no one else heard. They worked in silence so that others could survive. Their legacy is not a monument in stone. It is living -- in every Native child who grows up speaking Navajo, in every lesson about diversity strengthening nations, in every recognition that human culture holds power beyond calculation. The unbroken code remains unbroken, not only in history books, but in the truth that identity, memory, and language can become the strongest shield a nation has. The Navajo Code Talkers spoke messages Japan never decoded, but their greatest message was to the world: strength comes from many voices.